we're back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and joining me now is Matt Stoller. Matt is the author of the book Goliath on American monopolies. He is also the research director for the American Economic Liberties Project, which you can tell us a little bit more about. And he has a newsletter called Big, B-I-G, on Substack. So first of all, Matt, thanks for coming back on the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, always a pleasure. And before we get started, people can find Big at mattstoller.substack.com. Is that right?
Yeah, you can find all information about what I do and how at mattstoller.com, including a link to my Substack newsletter and the organization American Economic Liberties Project, which is a policy advocacy group that focuses on the problem of monopoly power.
Yeah, it's interesting. The phrase American economic liberties might sound right-wing to a lot of people, but in a sense, and maybe we can start here, it's neither right-wing nor left-wing. I mean, certainly breaking up monopolies was always a classic progressive tradition going back to Teddy Roosevelt, right? And if you're a conservative who believes in the theory of market competition, it should be a conservative position as well. Is that a fair statement from your point of view?
Yeah, the anti-monopoly tradition, there are multiple anti-monopoly traditions that go back hundreds of years, and they are situated on both the right and the left. And fundamentally, it's a business reformist tradition. So not just within small business or medium-sized businesses, but also workers, right? So it's always been concentration of capital versus the concentration of, or versus people who work for a living, whether they run businesses, whether they are working in those businesses, engineers, artists, farmers, whatever. And there are conservative variants of it. There are left-wing variants of it. And there are conservative pro-monopolists and left-wing pro-monopolists too. So right. It's an interesting scramble.
But I think anybody from a progressive point of view, which is a majority of this program's audience, for example, would you have to support the concept, I would think, because this kind of progressivism would say that corporations should not be able to obtain the market dominance and therefore other forms of dominance, as we've seen in for example, in the bailouts, the two bailouts now after 2008 and now after the first and second wave of pandemic relief, what you talk about in your newsletter, the Cantillon Effect, for example, the idea that, well, first of all, let's go there. I was tempted to complain about my own battles with monopolies today.
And let's do it. Let's do it, man.
Before we get to the theory, let's get to the nitty gritty, man, because this is what I dealt with today. Okay, I fairly recently, a couple of years ago, went on Medicare, which is a great program that I would love to see in some form extended to every American. But there is a privatized dimension to Medicare, which is the Medicare drug program, Part D. And here's what I was up against. I, for a chronic condition, receive quite an expensive biologic medication every month. And why it's expensive is another whole conversation, but it's quite expensive. Always received it without any problem. I had to pick an insurance company for my drug costs. I picked Silver Script, as it was called. And midway through my year, SilverScript was acquired by Aetna and became part of Aetna Healthcare. Aetna also owns CVS. So when my doctor wanted to try me on a different medication, they forced me to use CVS Specialty Pharmacy, which promptly announced it would cost me $180 a month to receive medication when the predecessor medication had been free. I'm almost done. Bear with me. Yeah. And because it was, and they were extremely difficult to deal with, but because it was CVS Specialty Pharmacy, common ownership with Aetna Healthcare, I couldn't change. I was mandated to use it, as difficult as they were. So I tried to switch back to have the injection that my doctor administers to me promptly. Instead of sending it to my doctor, they sent it to me with a bill for $285 saying, this is how you. So I've spent hours on the phone today trying to straighten this out, which I think I can. But, I'm unusually well equipped, though you might say, by background and training to deal with this, but I've spent hours. I'm extremely stressed and frustrated. And, imagine how people feel who are more infirm than I am, who are, have multiple.
And also, you shouldn't have to deal with it. Like, let's forget about, okay, yes, people who are like people with less power are going to feel it harder. But like, it's still not fair. It's still, well, we're FCC compliant, so I won't say the many.
Right. Matt, Troy gave you the lecture here.
But like, yeah. So what do you want? So CVS is I wrote a piece in my newsletter on how it's called How CVS Became a Healthcare Tyrant. And it went through a whole series of acquisitions that occurred starting really in the 80s, where they bought up a bunch of pharmacies and then larger chain pharmacies and then specialty pharmacies. And then they went and did what's called vertical integration, which is where you're not buying people that are in direct competition with you or in the same business. You're buying either your suppliers or your customers. They bought what's called a pharmacy benefits manager, which is something called like SilverScript. It sounds like is what you were talking about. And then they bought Aetna. And all of these purchases, they went to enforcers, because we have merger laws that say you're not allowed to buy companies if you're going to reduce competition. And of course they have, right? Because now you have to go to their stupid specialty pharmacy instead of going to other pharmacies. So that's obviously a reduction in competition. So clearly a bunch of these mergers should have been blocked or prohibited. But the way that we've corrupted antitrust law, I say I didn't do it. Just an FYI.
Right. Collectively. Understood. There's no collective guilt here. Yeah. Okay.
You can blame me. The way that they corrupted is they got economists to say, actually, when CVS wants to buy this chain, or they want to buy this PBM, or they want to buy, this insurance company, it's efficient. It'll be efficient because they will now be able to offer more stuff. When the Federal Trade Commission, which is one of our antitrust enforcers, they're supposed to enforce fair competition. They actually looked at the thing you called the specialty pharmacy problem. And specialty pharmacies create a bunch of problems. Like, they create not just problems for you, but they create problems for independent pharmacists. If you own your own pharmacy, which in a lot of rural America, the independent pharmacist is the healthcare provider, right? And now what they're doing is they're saying you can't go to that guy. You have to get your medicine from a specialty like mail order pharmacist. And when people go to these rural pharmacists, they get flu shots or they get actual healthcare checkups or whatever. And now they can't do that anymore. Well, the FTC looked at this, and when they saw that pharmacies were, or they like CVS and Walgreens and various others were starting specialty pharmacies, and these pharmacy benefit managers were starting specialty pharmacies to make sure that you couldn't use what you wanted to use for a pharmacy. You couldn't see the healthcare provider you wanted. The FTC looked at it and said, oh, actually, this is efficient. So we're going to allow this. And so they looked at that specific problem. They said the problems that you were encountering were blessed and sanctioned by policy, by economists at the FTC under the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Trump administration, right? And now we have this nightmarish situation where we have kind of single payer, actually even more than single payer. It's like CVS now owns kind of everything. They actually touch a third of Americans interact with a very part of CVS, except they're private, right? So it's like a private version of socialism, right? Where they socialize the losses and privatize the gains. So it's like this nightmare. It's this nightmare scenario. And right now that we're trying to do things about it. Like, we've got new good enforcers at the FTC. Finally, we got Lena Khan, who's awesome, and we're going to get a guy named Jonathan Cantor at the Antitrust Division at DOJ. But the antitrust laws have been weakened so dramatically that it's, you really going to need some changes to legislation. I mean, they'll bring cases, they'll do some things hopefully on PBMs. But these are problems that it took us 40 years to get into this situation. It's going to take some time to get out, but we're starting to dig out from it. That doesn't help you now, but Maybe in 5 years, it won't be as such a pain.
And it's not, and by the way, my story isn't over yet. There's another medication I take that I actually checked when I signed up for my pharmacy provider. Is this medication on the formulary, the list of approved
Right.
drugs? And it was. But after this acquisition, suddenly the pharmacy calls me today and says that will cost you $440 a month now because after the acquisition, it was not on the new formulary, which is another known problem, right? That these mergers and acquisitions in healthcare in particular change the rules midway through. And I just wanted to say, in terms of
Can I just say something about formularies? Because it's like this, it's such
sure. And then I want to say something about your comment about private sector single payer, but go ahead.
it's all such a scam. You know how you get on these, so it's totally reasonable to have a list of drugs that you can access, right? But what you would think is like a health insurance company would go to drug makers who produce drugs that are in the same class, so they treat the same condition, and they would go to them and say, all right, you guys have to compete to get on this formulary. The best price, the best quality, the best terms, you get on the formulary, right? So we have 3 insulin makers. They should compete, but somehow the prices keep skyrocketing, which you would not expect in a competitive market. Well, what are they actually competing over? In fact, to get on that formulary, they are paying the producers of the medicine are actually paying, in this case, presumably Aetna. They're giving them money to be put in front of you. So they're not going to those producers and saying, hey, give us your best price and we'll pass it along to the customers. They're actually saying, give us the biggest bribe. And the entity that gives us the biggest bribe, we'll put that in front of customers. And it's done in the form of a revenue sharing. So they probably, one of the things that's probably happening with you're going to have to pay a lot more for this other medication. Aetna's probably getting a piece of that. Right, like this whole system is just full of rampant commercial bribery, like rampant. That is why healthcare is so expensive. Is because there's like a ton of middlemen in the healthcare system, and they're all getting a piece, and they all have an incentive to keep inflating prices, and keep cutting each other in on the inflated prices. So it's totally insane. It's just like a nest of just basically criminal activity. And I know what this sounds like a little bit, aggressive, this rhetoric, but you have to look at the healthcare. If you do a little bit of digging into the healthcare system, there's a reason things are 2 and 3 times the cost here as they are in other countries. And it's just a nest of bribery. It's so insane. This is one of the reasons I kind of get annoyed at the single payer movement. And the healthcare people on the left, it's not that they're wrong. It's that they're only looking at the demand side.
Right.
And it's why not not everybody's going to agree on whether you have private insurance or public health insurance, but everybody agrees that rampant bribery to inflate costs is bad. So why not actually focus your political fire on that? And that's everybody hates the insulin cartel. Everybody, if you want to actually do something that is popular across all segments of the population, focus on that. And there's some firepower put on that. But just in terms of thinking about political strategy and policy, that's what I think we need to be recognizing. And I think the Republicans may actually end up going there first. Not totally sure about that. I mean, I still wouldn't bet on them, but they're starting to notice that the provider side is just really, really corrupt.
It would be, the delivery chain, if you will, of healthcare. I mean, it extends. Certainly, pharma is the most blatant example of it, but you can go all the way down the line in terms of radiology.
I'm writing a piece on hearing aids, and there's a hearing aid cartel. It's 6 firms, most of which are European. They share patents, and if you need a hearing aid, you have hearing loss or something, and you go to your health insurance company, they will have a part of they subcontract out to somebody who will help you figure out whether you need a hearing aid and which hearing aid you need to buy. Guess who they're subcontracting that out to? The hearing aid manufacturers. So it's you are going to be sent to a hearing aid manufacturer who will then to ask whether you need a hearing aid and what kind. So of course, you will always need a hearing aid, and you will always need the most expensive hearing aid. It's just all of this is, and there are kickbacks and all this other, it's just the whole system. This is this with dental implants. It's like this with, anybody who's bought glasses or contact lenses, it's super expensive, which is, it's not in other countries. Like, I mean, you can look at like every part of the healthcare, medical devices. It's all just, it's so insanely corrupt. And I mean, I don't actually focus on healthcare. I focus on like big tech.
Right.
But like, this is the American economy at this point. And what's interesting is that this is new. Like, this stuff we didn't used to have an economy that was based on corruption, or what I guess management consultants call strategy. It's like the McKinseyfication of American society really is a post 1981 phenomenon. Before that, we had very strong antitrust and regulatory regimes that were generally supported by both parties, more in the Democrats than the Republicans in the 20th century, but Republicans were there too. And then there was this revolution on the right and the left, and we kind of stopped seeing power. And so you roll it forward 40 years, and now it's like so many people in business, they don't even know that this stuff was illegal. They don't know it's wrong. They actually think, oh yeah, this is business, right? That's what capitalism is. And it's totally insane. It's like insane. It's like learned sociopathic behavior. And now we're having to like figure out what to do about it. One of the reasons the Democrats are so paralyzed is that they actually can't come to grips with the level of criminality happening at an elite level and the consequences of that criminality, right? The supply chain shortages are a result of this problem too. I mean, until 2019, Union Pacific, which is one of the big railroad companies, was tearing up tracks. And like, they shut down one of their major distribution centers in Chicago not because it wasn't profitable, but because it wasn't profitable enough. And so now you have all this backloaded like freight in the West Coast that you can't send to Chicago, which is where most of it is, like a lot of it is sent for distribution to the rest of the country, because they shut down that center because Wall Street hedge funds own the railroads and we don't have any regulation on railroads anymore. And so there's all of these boats now floating offshore because they can't unload stuff because you can't move that to Chicago to distribute to the rest of the country, and we can't get our Christmas presents. That's all a function of the lack of regulation and the economic consolidation of power over the guts and industrial commons of this country. And so that's the kind of politics that I focus on. I think that's really what most people actually kind of care about. That's what they want from their politics. And that's what, anti-monopoly politics really is.
And, as long as we're talking about Medicare for all, and as you know, you mentioned it in passing, I'm a hardcore Medicare for all guy, but that's a financing mechanism. That is it's not a delivery or distribution mechanism for either devices or pharmaceuticals or care itself. So in essence, it's, why pay these tragically inflated prices because of this corrupt and, should be criminal behavior. And I just wanted, but before we at all move on, Matt Stoller, I just wanted to, when you mentioned it,
there are commercial bribery statutes on the books that you could use to go after this behavior. So it's not, there is some stuff that Congress, it would be good if Congress did some stuff to fix this, but you actually don't need, you could do a lot of this with executive authority and better enforcement.
There were indictments and convictions in the Purdue Pharma case. I guess there's some relevance there, but it's few and far between. And the Sacklers just got a walk from a court recently. It just got a pass on future liabilities and so on. But
Judge Robert Drain, worst man in the world.
Yeah. And of course, they glom onto the doctors who are the most corruptible in all of this, too. And people die. This is but I just wanted to, before we move on, Matt Stoller, when you mentioned it as privatized socialism or whichever term you used, people have this stereotype that's been presented for a long time. Oh, government is a ossified bureaucracy, and like the DMV. I've actually had very pleasant visits to the DMV, but whatever, it varies from place to place. But I've always said if you hate, if you think government has the worst bureaucracies, try to cancel your Comcast subscriber account and get back to me. But for example, what I've been dealing through has been a bureaucratic nightmare of the worst order, just dealing with CVS, many hours on the phone, many hours on hold, being given wrong information.
Right.
So, all the things we stereotypically associate with quote unquote bureaucracy, not to mention the added layers of complication from the system itself that then I have to call the doctor and then I have to call the this and the that. This is what we've built for ourselves.
So the Reagan quote, the 9 most dangerous words in the English language. Today, if he were saying that each of the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are, I'm from Comcast and I'm here to help.
Right. Well, no, he'd probably still say government.
Well, but you know what I mean? Like,
yes, of course. Yeah.
I made that joke. I got a whole conference of libertarians to laugh at that. So they know what's going on. Like, they might think, oh, yeah. But like in their bones, if you laugh at that joke, it means that the corporate bureaucracies are just massively problematic. And I don't want to it's not that the government bureaucracy isn't the problem, because it is. And in fact, they are linked, because what you have with, a lot of the bureaucracies in DC is that they have this kind of symbiosis with big corporate actors. And it's pretty easy to regulate small banks, right? Because small bankers they're focused on just their communities. And when a regulator comes, they hand over what they need, they fix things, whatever. But when you go to regulate a big bank, you don't even get to really deal with the bankers. This is what I'm told by regulators. Like you have to deal with a special group, which is, will give you maybe PowerPoints on what they're thinking of doing. And they will fight you and they will go to, up a political level. And so you never really get to have any visibility into what the bank is doing. And it's just easier not to fight that. And that's a function of scale. And you see that across the economy. It's like, I guarantee you that Pfizer gets a better hearing at the FDA than some random company that's, making something that might be competitive. Like it's true kind of across the board. You have this it's a club at every one of these agencies. And the reason that it's got so bad is because we have these concentrations of private power. If you broke up these companies, then you wouldn't they wouldn't spend their time thinking about how to capture politics. They would spend their time trying to beat their competition and providing better products. That's why fundamentally the reason you don't want concentrations of private economic power is because that becomes that's just power. It's not private economic power. That's just an accumulation of power. It becomes political power, and it fundamentally becomes authoritarian power. And when you're dealing with CVS, right, and you're trying to deal with them effectively threatening your health, right, and putting stress on you, you're dealing with an authoritarian government in that sphere, right? That's authoritarianism. It's just in this very narrow sphere. So yeah, you have democracy. You can go to the voting booth. You can do all these things. Free speech, right? We can complain about this. But in that particular area, in terms of the access to medicine that you need, you are dealing with a dictator, and that with very limited rights. And that's a very, very significant political problem. As more parts of our society get consolidated under the hands of these mini dictators, we start to look around and we start saying, wait, are we actually living in a free society? And we mostly are, right? We're not in a dictatorship. I don't want to overstate it.
Right.
But, corporatism is not a totally free society. And the more corporatist you get, the more you kind of bleed over into what we're seeing.
And it's certainly not democratic in the sense that, take my medication, for example. If it had been a policy decision of, the Centers for the CMS or whomever that this should not be a covered drug, I could, write my congressman representative. I could write the White House and say, look, this is an autocratic, unfair decision. And, maybe they won't listen, but if 100,000 of us did, maybe they would, et cetera. But the government had nothing to do with this issue.
There would be public debates about it too.
There would be public debate.
It's like Congress argues a lot about Obamacare, right? But when CVS bought, or Aetna CVS bought Silver Scripts, right? that was just the decision. The debate happened in 2 boardrooms, and the public had no access to it at all.
And the decision not to cover this drug, which effectively means to deprive people of it, was made in boardrooms. It was not, and there's no recourse. You can't, write your congressman about it because the government has outsourced this very important policy decision to a corporation.
Right, and to a monopoly, right? Because you've had a lot of insurance companies and a lot of, and they, if there were alternatives, it would be different. But they know that there aren't, right? And all of it's based in, that's where the network of bribery and kickbacks comes in, because that helps. The reason they're using these kinds of tactics is to exclude competitors, right? That's the other is that that's why like Aetna says pony up if you want to be on our formulary and
right.
So forth.
Right. And there's a last thing on the healthcare maybe is, of course, they keep the system afloat with the mythology of being a smart healthcare consumer, right? This is the mythology, as if one individual up against a monopolistic situation is going to have any difference. Well, first of all, you can't know what conditions you're going to develop in the next year, so you don't know your needs. But secondly, in fairness to me, I was a smart shopper on this one. I looked, I checked, they covered it. But you can't be a smart shopper if they get to change the product halfway through, which is also, to me, a characteristic of monopolies, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a version of dominance. And, it's kind of loose. It's a loose type of fraud. And, look, fraud happens in every business, in every line of business. It's not unique to monopolies. But the difference is that when somebody cheats you and they're a monopoly, you have to go back to them, right? So it's like Aetna humiliates you and cheats you, but you don't have a choice but to go back and fight with them for it.
Right.
If I buy something, and it's not a good product, and I can find a different version of that from a different manufacturer, I will. But that's not an option here. So yeah.
Right. It's like, if I buy a shampoo and it's terrible, I can say your shampoo sucks. I'm going to buy a different one, but maybe not the best example in my case, but no, it's you got to use this shampoo forever. So, and that to me is the essence of all of this. And I guess we may never get to the Cantillon Effect, Matt Stoller, but
I can do a really short version of that.
Do a short version, and then maybe I'll have ask you for a last thought on conservatism. But okay, go ahead.
All right. So the Cantillon Effect is based on a 17th century or 18th century French economist, sort of one of the first economists. And what he said, his name is Cantillon, and what he said is that when you have a gold mine, right? Then the people near the gold mine get money first, and then people far away from the gold mine get access to that money because money was gold later on, and that has a distortionary effect on inequality and on inflation. To bring it forward to today, we don't use gold, but the Fed prints money, and so whenever we have a bailout, and I wrote the piece on the Cantillon Effect during the March 2020 bailouts, although we saw bailouts much earlier than that as well, in 2008-9. The closer you are to Wall Street and the Fed, the faster that money reaches you. So this was a way of explaining why, private equity, why the big banks got money very quickly, why rich people got money very quickly, because they are very close to Wall Street. They have accounts with the people that deal directly with the Fed. And why small businesses who have to work through a rickety system of small banks that have a very poorly staffed agency, the Small Business Administration, why it took them much longer to get access to that safety net. And then why individuals also had problems as well, because our main connection to the government is through the IRS, and that is also underfunded and rickety. So it's about the institutions of money creation. And we have traditionally assumed that money is what's called neutral, which is that if you put some money into the economy, it hits everyone equally at once. In fact, that's not true. The money is not a neutral commodity. If you want it to be neutral, it flows along the institutional frameworks of our society. Right now, the institutional links between the Fed and the wealthy and dominant firms are much stronger than the institutional links to everyone else. So money is not neutral. It didn't used to be this way from the 30s till the 70s. We actually had a pretty neutral set of systems. You had a whole bunch of different financial institutions that did connect people to the Fed and to our centers of monetary power. So money was more neutral, but we sort of have systematically taken those apart. So that's the Cantillon effect, why Wall Street gets a bailout and why you don't.
And we saw last week that the earnings for the biggest banks were boffo, were just the best ever. So I guess in closing, Matt Stoller, I would just say, it seems to me that we're seeing the worst possible outcome. America's had always a healthy strain of "you're not the boss of me," and it's in its political psyche, right? And we're seeing some of the worst of that in the refusal to take vaccines and a tragic loss of life that comes from that. And I'm just hoping that we can redirect at some point some more of that energy towards fighting monopolies and less towards fighting public health programs. But what's your last thought?
Right. I mean, I think that a lot of the culture war. So I don't really write a lot about the culture war stuff. My view is the culture war is, there's some legitimate disagreements, but so much of it is about distracting us from the small dominant class that kind of controls our economy, controls our politics, controls our society. So I don't want to fight about the right people for Mark Zuckerberg to censor. I think.
Me neither. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Why is Mark Zuckerberg in control of our public discourse at all? Right. That's the more important. And you actually have a lot of agreements on them from the right and the left. Once you actually say, hey, wait a second, how's this advertising money, this $100 billion of advertising money? Like, let's actually focus on that. Let's actually focus on the corporate structures, the money and power, as opposed to like whatever dumb stuff you see on MSNBC or Fox News or whatever kind of chattering class nonsense there is today.
Yeah, trust me, that is exactly what I was getting at, actually, was that, this energy, this desire for independence is being rechanneled into these culture war issues instead of more people, in my view, fighting for genuine independence over the corporations that have such control over their lives. So if that point wasn't clear, I want you to just clarify that.
It's clear. It's clear. We just agree.
Yeah. So, okay.
Good luck with that. Tell him I said hi.
I'll tell Matt sends his best. Yeah, all right, Matt Stoller, research director of, let me get this name right, the American Economic Liberties Project, and mattstoller.substack.com. As always, great talking with you, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Hey, thanks for having me. Bye.
Our pleasure. Bye. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.